Well, hello, happy July. This is Greg from Supposedly Fun, here today to do my reading wrap-up for the month of June. Now, it's a funny thing. I had a really strong reading month in June. I read a lot of really great books, and this is where I feel like the way I structure my reading wrap-ups for months is going to fail me, because I rank them from worst to best. And this month I almost don't even want to do that because it implies that the ones at the bottom are bad books. And here's the thing, I read a lot of really great books in the month of June. So none of them are bad, none of them are things I would not recommend, but something's got to be on the bottom, so just let's proceed with that warning. I did have a really great reading month in terms of numbers as well. I read 7 books, which is on par for the rest of the month. Thankfully, I got off to a really strong start in the beginning of the month, and I had been hoping that I could pull ahead and make a little bit of an extra push, but with everything going on with the house, I slowed down a lot at the end of the month and ended up just kind of hitting the similar numbers to what I've read every other month in the year so far. So I have read 46 books so far in 2019. My reading goal on Goodreads was only 55, so I'm going to be good with that. I'm thinking I might push myself to try to hit 100, which I've never done since I started keeping track. So I think that's going to be a good goal for me. In terms of my reading goals, I had a reading goal to read more books by women than by men. I continue to do really well on that. So of the 7 books that I read in the month of June, 5 of them were written by women. Of the 46 books that I've read in 2019, 35 were written by female authors. That means I've only read 11 books that were written by men. I have a lot of books by men on my TBR, but I think I'm in really good shape to make that a dream a reality. As my other goal, to read more books that feature lesbian, bisexual, and transgender characters or by authors in those areas. I'm not knocking it out of the park like the other goal, but I did a lot better. I had 4 books that feature lesbian, bisexual, or transgender characters. And by the way, this leads me to an idea. If you have recommendations for books that have bisexual representation, I would love it. I feel like I stumble on them by accident, but there are not a whole lot of recommendations out there that will point you to good ones. So if you have one, I would love to hear it. Now, I did not DNF anything because, as I said, this was a really good reading month. All of the books that I read were very good. So let's just get into the ranking, and this is going to be really painful. So the book that comes in last, in 7th place, is Boy Erased by Garrett Conley. And again, that makes it sound like this is a bad book. It is not. I absolutely recommend this book. It's a very good book. The only reason it's ending up on the bottom is that I thought at times it's a little overwritten. It kind of sounds like Garrett Conley is trying too hard to make things sound pretty, and it just ends up sounding awkward to me. I also think the way the book was structured in terms of the timeline is unnecessarily complicated. It weaves back and forth in time, and maybe it's that I listened to the audiobook and it made it hard to figure out where you are in time, but I felt like a more linear approach would have made more sense. And that's the only reason this one's ending up on the bottom. I really liked it. I thought it was an important book. If you don't know what it's about, it is a memoir about Garrett Conley's experience with conversion therapy. His parents were very religious and made him go to conversion therapy, so it's about his experience growing up religious, going into conversion therapy, and ultimately leaving conversion therapy and learning to accept who he is, and his family's journey of acceptance with him. It's a beautiful story. It's really good. I recommend it. It's kind of heartbreaking that it's ending up in last place. Coming in at number 6 is another book I really liked. It's My Sister the Serial Killer by Oyinkan Braithwaite. This is on the one hand, this is a great summer reading book. It is about, of course, a woman who has a sister who is a serial killer. And if you read it in that summer reading kind of psychological thriller way, it's going to be a great read for you. But you can also go a lot more deeply into this book and get some really interesting insights into what it's like to grow up in a world, a patriarchal society as a woman, complicated family relationships and codependence. There are a lot of different levels at which to read this book, and all of them work. So again, it feels kind of heartbreaking that this book is coming in at number 6. By the way, in most other months, except maybe April, this year, both of these would have scored very high. So it just they just happened to fall into a really strong reading month, and that's the way life goes. Coming in at number 5 is a book called Transgender History by Susan Stryker. Now again, the only reason this is going lower on my list is that I didn't need the introduction. The introduction to this book, I'm sorry, the first part of this book, not the introduction, is a lot about clarifying terminology, like what is genderqueer, what is gender fluid, what is cisgender, things like that. I didn't need that foundation, but I can see where a lot of people would, and I think because this book is supposed to be making all of these topics accessible to the average person, I feel like it is important, and it's easy enough for me to skip it, but just because I didn't need it, I feel like it ended up lower lower in the ranking. And it's, if I sound defensive, it's because all of these books are good. And then once I skipped past that first section that was defining terms, I really found this book fascinating. There were a lot of really great stories, a lot of people who have not traditionally been talked about in mainstream media who deserve to be more well known. And I think this is, again, a very important book to read, to engage with, and to use for further exploration. Is definitely worth it. Coming in at number 4, again, a book I really liked, Housekeeping by Jeanette Winterson. This is the story of Silver, whose father is just out of the picture, never really in the picture in the first place. She loses her mother and ends up becoming the ward of a man who keeps a lighthouse, and she becomes his apprentice, and he tells her stories about somebody else who lived in the town. Jeanette Winterson is she's a poet, and this is written in a very poetic way. I did think at times there would be sentences in here that would like punch me in the gut. They were so good, and I would stop and marvel at them, and then you'd keep reading and it would go too far and become a little bit flowery. And again, that's the only reason this book is scoring a little bit lower on the scale. It's a really great, beautiful book. It's very emotional. One of the things I really like is that it had been presented to me as a coming out story of a lesbian character, and it's not your traditional coming out story. The fact that she dates women later in her life is treated very matter-of-factly, and I actually really appreciate that, because it makes it seem like her sexuality is not the most important thing about her, which is really nice, and something I appreciate, and it's a beautiful book. I really liked it a lot. Coming in at number 3 is Dancer from the Dance. Now, I have not done a specific review of this one yet, and I'm still going to. So this is really, I guess, the first time you're really going to hear my thoughts on it. I liked it. When I get to my full review, I'm going to call it The Great Gatsby. And for anybody who doesn't like The Great Gatsby, that's going to sound like a criticism. It is not. I like The Great Gatsby. The Great Gatsby is a great book. It's a portrait of a character named Malone who is in New York City in the 60s and 70s, and he becomes submerged in the gay subculture of the time. He wants love, but basically, the way society is structured, he can't get married. He's denied the dignity of a human relationship. So he falls into the subculture where sex kind of substitutes for actual connection with people, and he gets lost. And what I think is interesting about this book is that part of that is his own doing. He sometimes will find chances at love and he'll mess them up. But that's a very human thing, and I think that's something that made Malone very relatable. He's not a perfect person. He's not just a character in a book who has this one thing, like he's out for love and that's it. He makes mistakes, and that's really good. I really respect him as a character. I enjoyed this book. I think it is a classic on par with The Great Gatsby and a lot of other books that probably should be essential reading for a lot of people. It's very good. And again, the fact that it's coming at number 3 really says a lot about the quality of the books that I have been reading in June. Coming in at number 2, and I don't know if this is going to, this book's standing is going to change throughout the rest of the year when I get to my annual wrap-up for 2019. It's The Paying Guests by Sarah Waters. I really enjoyed this book. I got carried away with it, and I think a lot of that had to do with the fact that I listened to it on audio, and Juliet Stevenson, who reads the audio, really performs this. She bites into this, and it's amazing. She does a really great job, and I got very carried away listening to her read this. So in this book, Frances Ray and her mother have fallen on hard times. Frances's father had mismanaged money and then died, and they got left with all of his debt. So they have to take in lodgers, Lillian and Leonard Barber, who move in, and things happen. It gets complicated. And the book does take a left turn in the middle. And the first half of the book is slow. But I had never read a Sarah Waters book. And I forgot to mention that I completely neglected to mention Sarah Waters when I did my list of LGBTQ books that I want and authors that I want to read. So in order to atone for that, I made sure I listened to this in the month of June. And I had never read one of her books before. And maybe that's it, because once I finished it, I was looking online, and it seems like this is consensus the book that her fans like the least. So maybe it was a good introduction for me, because since I haven't read the other ones, I didn't feel disappointed. Or maybe it's just that I got carried away with the audio, or maybe it's just that I like this one, and that's what it is. I thought her writing was so great in the first half and they did a lot of interesting character work, and that set a foundation that made the left turn into something more of a standard crime thriller with a court scene. It made that more exciting to me, and I because you had done all that work, you had all the characters, and I don't want to go too in depth because I will do a longer video about this, but I think it made one of the characters who was not interesting to me in the first half interesting in the second half. I just happened to be reading this at the same time as Matthew Sharap. He was kind enough to talk a little bit about the ending with me, and I'm still processing the stuff that we had talked about, so I will do a longer video later. So stay tuned for that. And then, right at the end of the month, just right under the wire, I got to what ended up being my favorite read in the month of June. It's Good Talk by Mira Jacob, a memoir and conversations. This is a graphic memoir. So it's about the difficult questions that Mira Jacob's son asked her about race and racism during the course of the 2016 presidential election. Mira Jacob's parents immigrated from India, and her son is biracial. He has a white father, and she is obviously his mother. She has these complicated conversations with him, and then it's interesting too because it talks about how he can't talk about these things with his father. He's very reluctant to talk about these things with his white father, and it has all of these very interesting things to say about that. And Mira goes back and talks about her childhood growing up in America as someone of color, and when she goes back to India, how the family treats her because she is more dark-skinned than the rest of the family. And it's very interesting. It's laugh out loud funny. It has a lot of really great observations. I think this is a really great book for the current time, but I think it will continue to be a really great snapshot of this time 10 years down the road, 20 years down the road, 100 years down the road, to see what it was like to be living in this political moment in this society where race is still a very complicated issue that people don't really want to engage in. And it's very smart, it's very humane and thought-provoking. I really enjoyed it. I got it from the library, and I definitely recommend you check it out. It is extremely good. So those are the things that I read in the month of June. I would love to hear what you read in June and what you were liking, and maybe what you didn't like. Like I said, none of the books that I have talked about are duds. I recommend you add them to your TBR, check them out, give them some thought. And I'm going to be doing, I think, a tag video tomorrow, and then I'll be doing my wrap-up for the first half of 2019. And as always, I really appreciate your time watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it enough to follow along if you don't already. I'll be back again, and until then, happy reading.